Hey, everybody, welcome to the series of lectures on the nervous system. This is going to be the first in a series of 3 or 4 different lectures that we do on the nervous system. So let's get started. So the functions of the nervous system are going to be sensory inputs and then motor outputs. But sensory inputs are the gathering of information, right? And that's what part of our nervous system is going to do. It's going to take a look at the world around us, the environment around us, and take in as much information as possible and give that information to your brain so that your brain can figure out what to do with that information, right? Your nervous system monitors changes occurring inside and outside the body, right? So if you're playing a sport, and I'm a baseball player, and a hockey player, so if I use baseball and hockey as examples, I apologize if you don't if you don't know anything about those two sports, but you get the basic idea, I think, right? If a ball or a puck is flying at you, that is a stimulus that your nervous system gathers information about, gives it to your brain. Your brain has to figure out what to do with that, right? So your body has to change on the outside, right? The position of your body has to change, or the movement of your body has to change. Inside the body could be something like, blood glucose. Okay, the levels of blood glucose inside the body rising or decreasing are a stimulus or a change that the body has to, that the senses have to input or gather information about, and then give it to your brain so that it can figure out what to do. Right? We mention these changes as stimuli. Okay, anything that causes change in either inside or outside the body is considered to be a stimulus. Now, what the brain does is it does something called integration, right? So these sensory nerves that you have, which are your eyes, your ears, your taste, your smell, your touch, all those things are called sensory receptors. And those sensory receptors gather the info and give it to your brain for what we call integration. Okay, so the brain is going to integrate this information and decide or interpret what action is needed by the body, right? And that's what your brain does. It processes and interprets sensory inputs and decides what action is needed to deal with those particular inputs. Sometimes no action is needed. Sometimes a movement or a chemical or a hormone needs to be produced in order to deal with that input. Okay. After the integration occurs, we have what we call a motor output. And this motor output is the response that was triggered by or integrated by the brain about that stimulus, right? So if you have a ball rolling towards you on a baseball field, okay, your brain has to take into account the speed of that ball, the trajectory of that ball, and then it tells your muscles where to put your body in order to catch that ball, or maybe to get out of the way of the ball, depending. Maybe you're up at the plate and the ball's coming at you and you don't want to get hit with the pitch, right? Or something like that. Okay. Typically, these motor outputs are going to activate muscles or activate glands in the body. Okay. So the muscles needed to put yourself into the position to get that ball would be a motor output. Going back to the blood glucose, right? If your blood glucose either rises or drops, okay, the response or the motor output might be for the pancreas to produce insulin, right? So those are, physical examples as well as chemical examples. Okay, here is just a diagram of what I was just saying. So you see something happening, right? And this eye could be replaced with either, the ear or, the sense of smell, okay, your nose, sense of touch, whatever it is, okay, sense of taste. Okay, any of those are called sensory receptors, but a sensory receptor is going to see or pick up some information that we call a stimulus. It's going to give that input to the brain, where it is then integrated, and then the brain's going to make a decision. And once that decision is made, it causes some type of motor output. Okay, in this case, maybe, the leg muscle, the response here is to run towards something or away from something, or to jump. Okay, something to do with the leg. Okay, but again, it doesn't always have to be physical. It could be chemical, like I said before, with like the blood glucose levels and things like that. Okay, so there are two major classifications of the nervous system. The first one is called the central nervous system, and the central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord. And then you have the peripheral nervous system, which is everything other than the brain and the spinal cord. So anything that comes off of the brain, anything that comes off of the spinal cord is going to be the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS, or the central nervous system, CNS. Okay, so examples would be the spinal nerves that come off of your spine, the cranial nerves that come off of your brain. Okay, those are all peripheral nerves. Now, we have some words that we have to memorize here, and we already saw the words sensory and motor, right? But they have other synonyms that we need to use and be familiar with. Okay, afferent and efferent. Okay, it's kind of like affect and effect, right? So a sensory nerve is also called an afferent nerve. Okay, sensory nerve, afferent. They are synonyms. Okay, these are nerve fibers that carry information to the central nervous system. Okay, so you have the eyeball here, right? That eyeball is going to carry information to the brain itself. Okay, and that's called an afferent nerve. Okay, once that brain, okay, which is the central nervous system, right? Once that brain integrates and decides what to do, okay, and causes muscles to move, okay, that is called an efferent nerve. The nerves leading from the brain to the muscle are called efferent. So this is afferent, this is called efferent. Okay, and that's because they are moving away from the central nervous system. Okay, so here we're moving towards the central nervous system, and here we're moving away from the central nervous system. So that's the difference between sensory, which is an input, or afferent, which is an input, and motor, which is output. Okay, sensory in, motor out. Okay, here is a nice little flow chart that kind of breaks up the organization of the nervous system. So we have our central nervous system, we have our brain, spinal cord. Okay, we have our peripheral nervous system, which is the cranial nerves and spinal nerves. And those peripheral nerves can be broken up into two groups. Okay, sensory ins, which are called afferent, or motor outs, called efferent. Okay, these afferent nerves are your sense organs. That's your nose, eyes, touch, smell, and taste. Okay, and then your motor nerves are going to be things like your skeletal muscles, your heart, your smooth muscles of your digestive system, the glands that you have. Now, they're in two different groups because some of these motor nerves are voluntary and some of these motor nerves are involuntary, right? Some of them you consciously control and some of them you do not. You consciously control your skeletal muscles, right? All of your biceps and triceps and pectoralis and all those other skeletal muscles, you control those voluntarily. You want to lift your arm up, you lift your arm up, right? We call those nerves that control voluntary things somatic. Okay, they're somatic efferent or somatic motor nerves. Okay, the things that you do not control, such as your heart, right? You can slow your heart down, but you can't stop your heart, right? So your heart is considered to be involuntary, and we learn that in the muscle chapters. Your digestive system is smooth muscle. You cannot control your digestive system as either consciously, right? Your glands, your pancreas, your pituitary, your thyroid, all those different glands that you have, you don't control those. Those are all controlled by your brain directly, not with your conscious thought, right? So all of those motor nerves are called autonomic because they automatically happen without you having to consciously think about it. So those are involuntary. All right, so our sensory or afferent nerves are all of our sense organs. Our motor nerves can be broken up into somatic, voluntary ones, or autonomic, involuntary ones. And you should know the difference between the two. We'll get into parasympathetic and sympathetic in a little bit. Okay. Once again, let's just go back to those motor and afferent and efferent nerves. So your motor nerves, your efferent division, can be broken down, like I just said, it's the same thing, it's just writing now. Okay, the motor division can be broken into that somatic or autonomic nervous systems, either voluntary or involuntary. Okay, the next thing we want to know, we're going to switch gears a little, and we want to start talking about support cells of the nervous tissue. All right, there's only one type of nervous cell, and that's called a neuron. And we're going to learn a lot about a neuron in a minute. But there's only one cell that makes up your nervous structures, like your brain, your spinal cord, your peripheral, and cranial nerves are all made up of neurons. But there are other cells in your nervous tissue that support the nervous system, and we call those support cells, we call those neuroglia. And there's about 5 or 6 of them that I want to talk to you about in this lecture. Okay, and what they all do, they all function to support, insulate, and protect neurons, right? The neurons, again, are the cells of the nervous system, and these neuroglia are going to support, insulate, and protect those neurons. So let's start with this first one, which is called an astrocyte. Okay, an astrocyte is a star-shaped cell that helps to brace neurons. Okay, brace meaning give support to, right? In a skyscraper, there are beams inside, like behind the walls and the ceilings and the floors. There are things called I-beams, and those I-beams give support to the structure so that it can stand up straight. Okay, those are called braces. All right, if you were to put a knee brace on, that knee brace is there to support your knee so that it doesn't bend in the wrong directions, right? So how is it going to support your neurons? Okay, it forms barriers between capillaries and neurons, right? We don't want things getting tangled up and twisted up inside the body. So these astrocytes are going to help form barriers between things like that. And it's also going to help control the environment, the chemical environment of the brain. But these two are the more important things that I want you to know about astrocytes. So here's a picture of an astrocyte, and it's this large star-shaped cell here. Okay, and it has all these like arms on it that you can see are touching a whole bunch of different things, right? So this big yellow guy here, that's a neuron. Okay, this big yellow thing here is a neuron. Okay, and that neuron lies next to these purple tubes that are called capillaries. And these capillaries, we don't want them getting intertwined with our nerves. We don't want our nerves getting tangled up. We don't want our capillaries getting tangled up. So this astrocyte, you could see, surrounds the neurons, surrounds the capillaries, and kind of keeps them separated and forms a barrier between the two. Okay. The next one I want to talk about is called a microglia cell. Okay. And a microglia cell is a spider-like phagocyte, which is going to help dispose of debris. A phagocyte is a very common term that we use with white blood cells. Okay. And anything that does phagocytosis is going to basically engulf bacteria, virus particles, or debris in the cellular environment. Okay, so if we have a white blood cell here and we have a bacteria, okay, this white blood cell can actually engulf. See if I can do a good drawing here. Okay, this white blood cell can actually engulf this bacteria in a little vesicle, and once it's inside, it can break it down and destroy it. All right, that's how white blood cells are supposed to work, or some of our white blood cells are supposed to work like that in order to kill bacterial cells. Well, these microglia can do that within your nervous system to keep the environment of the neurons debris free so that they can work properly. Okay, here is an example of a microglial cell. Okay, it looks very similar. I'm not going to ask you to identify these in pictures, okay, but I will ask you to know the definitions of them. Okay, ependymal cells. These are cells that line the cavity of the brain and the spinal cord, and they circulate what we call cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, your brain and your spinal cord are surrounded in fluid, and that fluid cannot stand still. Just like any other fluids, you don't want fluids standing. You don't want still water, okay, like in a puddle, okay, because that'll breed infection and bacteria, fungus, algae, things like that. You don't want that in your body either, right? You want all of your liquids to be moving constantly so that they don't stagnate, right? And your cerebrospinal fluid is the fluid that surrounds your brain and your spinal cord, and you don't want that to be stagnant either. You don't want bacteria growing in there. You don't want infection in there. So those ependymal cells will help to circulate the liquids or the cerebrospinal fluids in your brain and spinal cord. You can see them here. They have these like little cilia on the top. And you see these cilia a lot where you see liquids or things that need to be moving around, something that's viscous. Okay, you see these cilia on these cells in the brain and spinal cord. You also see these cells in the lungs, okay, to move mucus around, in sinus cavities, okay, to move mucus around, in digestive systems as well. Okay, you see these a lot. Oligodendrocytes. Oligodendrocytes are cells that are going to produce something called myelin. Okay, now these are in the central nervous system. Okay, these are in the central nervous system, and they produce myelin. Myelin is an insulator. Okay, you all have seen cables or wires before, or plugs, right? If you have a plug for your Apple computer or something like that, right? There's your little charger for your Apple phone or your iPhone or whatever. And this wire here is coated in rubber. Now, the reason it's coated in rubber is so that you don't get electrocuted when you touch the wires. You don't want your neurons to have any frayed wiring either, right? If you had exposed copper in a wire coming out of the wall and you touch the copper when it's plugged into the wall, you'll get electrocuted. The same thing goes for your neurons. Your neurons carry electricity just like a wire carries electricity from a wall. Same type of electricity. So if that electricity gets out and touches something that it's not supposed to touch, what you're going to experience is something like a tick or a twitch or something like that, right? You've all probably heard of Parkinson's disease. Michael J. Fox has Parkinson's disease. He is the actor that was in Back to the Future. He suffers from Parkinson's, and basically what Parkinson's is that it breaks down the myelin in your body, right? So over time, the myelin that surrounds your nerves gets broken down, and you lose control of your muscles because there's electricity getting thrown out all over the place. It's like having a whole bunch of wires with exposed copper, right, without the rubber covering on them. But that's what these oligodendrocytes do, is they produce myelin so that they can insulate your neurons. Okay, so here's my oligodendrocyte, and these things that kind of look like wrapping paper or rolls of paper towels. Okay, that is the myelin, and this yellow piece here, that's my neuron. My neuron is going through this entire piece of myelin, and it's being insulated, okay, by that myelin. Okay, so that nerve would be going down here, but it's covered in this myelin. It's covered in nice fatty myelin sheets. Okay, and the reason that it's made of fats, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but the reason it's made of fats is so that it's a good insulator. It's a bad conductor of electricity, just like rubber is used around wires because rubber is a bad conductor of electricity. Okay, and then we have satellite cells and Schwann cells. Satellite cells protect the cell bodies of neurons, and I'll get into what a cell body is in a moment. But a Schwann cell is very much like an oligodendrocyte. It produces myelin. However, it's not in the central nervous system. It's in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so the Schwann cells are the oligodendrocyte of the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so here you see Schwann cells. Okay, this is a cell, a neuron here. And these little, almost look like jelly beans. Those are the myelin sheaths that are made by Schwann cells. Okay, they look a little different, right? If I go back 2 pictures, okay, here we have long, slender tubes of myelin, where here we have these little short, stubby wraps of myelin. Same product, same chemical, same function, insulates the nerve. Okay, but one is for the central nervous system, and one is for the peripheral nervous system. Okay, now let's talk about neurons. Okay, the neuron is the major cell, or really the only cell that you find in the nervous system. Okay, and it has a couple of different parts that we want to talk about. Okay, there's the cell body that we want to talk about, and then there's the processes that come off of the cell body. The cell body itself contains the nucleus and is the metabolic center of the cell, which means all the respiration, all the different chemical processes that are going to happen in the cell occur in the cell body. And then you have the processes, which is anything that extends from that cell body. And we have two of them. We have things called dendrites and we have axons. And it's going to be on the PowerPoint in a minute, but I just wanted to write it down. Okay. Don't worry about that slide. Here, let's take a look at this picture. So here is our picture of a neuron. This is a very typical picture of a neuron that you might see. Here's a microscope image of a neuron. Okay. Here we have our cell body. That's this piece right here. That's our cell body. Inside the cell body is a nucleus. That's where our DNA is held, right? We're also going to have mitochondria in here for energy production, ATP production, okay, things like that. And then we're going to have processes that come off of this cell body, right? We see these little processes here and the little extension of the cell body look like little tentacles, okay? The ones that come directly off of the cell body are called dendrites. Okay. Then we have this really long extension here that ends in these little like whips over here. This whole thing is called the axon. And at the very end of the axon, where this axon frays into little smaller axons, those are called axon terminals. Okay. Now, I love to think of neurons as like a set of holiday lights, or I say Christmas lights, okay, where on one end you have the female end that accepts a plug, then you have all the lights, and then at the other end you have the male end, which has the two metal prongs. And what happens is that you plug one set into another set, right, and so on and so forth until you're done lighting up your windows, your tree, or whatever you're lighting up. The same thing goes for neurons, okay? The dendrites and the axons are like the male and female ends of the plug, okay? You see this arrow here. That arrow is actually telling you how the electricity moves through this neuron. Electricity always moves from dendrite to axon. It always moves in that direction. You're always going to have electrical flow from dendrite through and to the axon terminals. And at the axon terminals, you'll have another dendrite of another neuron. And that electricity will then jump from axon to dendrite and then go down towards the next axon to where it's hooked up to the next dendrite. And then it'll flow down to the next neuron until it hits some type of muscle that it controls, right? If this was your deltoid, then your arm, if electricity went down all these nerves, then hit your deltoid, your arm would raise up in the air, right? You'd put your hand up, okay? And that's basically how these neurons work. They plug into one another end to end, right? Axon to dendrite, axon to dendrite, axon to dendrite, until it gets to the thing that it wants to actually affect, which could be a gland or a muscle, right? We can see the myelin sheaths here, okay? We know that this is a peripheral nerve because they're short and stubby little myelin sheaths. Okay. Okay, so once again, just to go over that one more time, cell body has the nucleus and a large nucleolus. That's where our RNA is made. Right? RNA is formed in the nucleolus. That's where the control center of our cell. And then we have our dendrites and our axons. And dendrites conduct impulses towards the cell body, and axons carry impulses away from the cell body. So if I go back to this picture, okay, electricity is going to go from the dendrite, to the cell body, and then the axon takes it away from the cell body. Okay, axons end in the terminals. Like I said before, these terminals deal with vesicles of neurotransmitters, which we'll talk about in a moment. Okay, and there's no physical connection between the axon and the dendrites. Okay, when I talk about Christmas lights, there's a physical connection between the metal prongs of one end and the female end ports. Right, when you plug this metal into those two ports, there's metal in there, and when those two pieces of metal touch, you can have electricity pass from one set of lights to the other set of lights, right? You're making a metal to metal connection. In your nervous system, that's not necessarily the case, right? You have dendrites and here's an axon, and here's another dendrite, and here's another axon, there's no physical connection between these two neurons. Okay. If there was a physical connection between the two neurons, we would have trouble stopping the current, right? Think of this as a light switch. If I constantly kept the light switch on, then the lights would never go off. But because it's a light switch, I can turn the switch off and the current stops, right? If we had physical connections all the time between axons and dendrites, if these were touching all the time, we would have issues turning off the action, right? If the electricity ran through these nerves and that caused me to raise my hand, if I had physical connections here, I would never put my hand down because the electricity would never stop flowing. So I have to have some type of feature that stops the electrical current from flowing from one place to another. And what we do, or what the body does, is it has spaces between dendrite. So here's a dendrite, axon, dendrite, right? There's physical spaces between the dendrites and axons of neighboring nerves, and those are called synapses. And that little space, or the junction between the nerves, is called the synapse, and the space between is called a synaptic cleft. Okay, so we have to have electricity jump from one nerve to the next, and it does so with the use of neurotransmitters. A neurotransmitter is a chemical that allows the flow of electricity from one neuron, from neuron to neuron. Right now, without these chemicals, the electricity will never pass from one neuron to the next. Okay. These myelin sheaths, once again, whitish fatty material that covers the axons. Okay, they are going to be insulators. They're produced by Schwann cells, but in between those myelin sheaths are little gaps. There are little gaps in the myelin, and those are called nodes of Ranvier. Okay, and we can see those in the picture here. All these little gaps that fall between the sheaths of myelin, those are called nodes of Ranvier. Okay. Here's a picture of the neuron or the axon being wrapped in myelin by the Schwann cell. Here's our little Schwann cell, and it's producing this like gelatin myelin that's wrapping around it. Okay, now when we talk about the nervous system, we're going to hear the terms gray matter and white matter a lot. When you actually cut the brain open or you cut a spinal cord open, you actually see two distinct colors. It's one of those things where you actually do see two distinct colors in the human body. You can't distinguish between blood vessel, like veins and arteries. Once you cut the body open, they all look the same. But gray matter and white matter are very different colors because of their chemical composition. Okay. Only parts that have myelin on them are going to look white. Okay. So parts of a neuron that don't have myelin on them are going to appear gray and look darker. So if I go back to my picture here, the only part of this neuron that is covered in myelin is the axon. And this is going to have a white appearance. Okay, it's going to have a white appearance. And this area does not have any myelin. This will have a gray appearance. So when you cut open a brain or a spinal cord and you see a very white area, that's an area that's very rich in axons. If you see an area that's more gray or less white, that's going to be an area that's very rich in cell bodies and dendrites. Okay, so just to put it in simple terms. Okay, so gray matter is where the cell bodies are, and they are unmyelinated. Okay. There are things called ganglia, which are collections of cell bodies, which are outside of the central nervous system. We find those in the peripheral nervous system, and we call them ganglia, and they're scattered around the body. Okay. So once again, just to kind of go back to our sensory and motor functions. Okay. Again, we mentioned this once before already, but we're just going to reiterate it again. Your sensory or afferent neurons carry impulses from the sensory receptors to your brain, right? So your eyes, ears, touch, taste, smell, all of that goes to your central nervous system, your brain, and your spinal cord. You can find them in your skin, okay, cutaneous sense organs, and all the other ones that I said. Your motor or efferent neurons do the opposite. They carry impulses from the central nervous system to the viscera or the surface of the muscles and the glands. Okay, here is a diagram that just shows you different types of either sensory or motor nerves, right? We have here, that's obviously pain, right? Cutting your finger, okay, would be a pain receptor that's in your subcutaneous, in your skin. Okay, we also, this is touch, right? But this is also touch as well. Two different touches, right? One is painful touch, one is more of a gentle touch. Okay, this is a pressure touch, right? This is pain, this is light touch, this is deep touch when you're like if you rolled a lemon or a grapefruit or a ball. Okay, and here would be more of a motor nerve, right? That is causing a muscle to contract to lift up the dumbbell. Okay. Interneurons. We're going to talk about interneurons a little bit more when we talk about the reflex arc and things like that. But an interneuron is found between motor and sensory nerves in the spinal cord, okay, and where the peripheral nerves branch off of the spinal cord. Okay, so let's take a look at this diagram here. Okay. So here is the spinal cord. We can see the gray and white matter, right? We can see that here. Here's the gray matter. Here's the white matter. So these are all my cell bodies and our dendrites. And all the axons are coming off and forming this white matter or surrounding it, right? Okay. And we can see here that in the back or the dorsal side of the spine, okay, we have our sensory nerves. Okay, we have our afferent inputs, our sensory inputs. And then we have our motor outputs coming from the ventral side of the spinal cord. So information from the eyes, ears, touch, taste, smell all go in here. They'll hit the spinal cord, and then they'll go up to the brain. Okay, they'll go up to the brain. They'll come back down from the brain. The integration will come back down from the brain and send out an impulse out of our motor end. The interneuron is here. That's our interneuron. The interneuron is going to connect the sensory to the motor nerves. Now, we only are going to use these interneurons when we don't have time to properly integrate all the information in enough time, right? We call that a reflex, right? So what the interneuron does is if, let's say, you don't have enough time to think and integrate the information that's given to you, your body will basically bypass the brain and just go like this. So normally what would happen is the information goes in and then up and then down and then out, right? That's what normally would happen if you have enough time, right? If a ball's hit you nice and slowly, okay, that ball, you have enough time to integrate, make a decision, perform a function, right? If that ball's coming at you really too fast, you don't have time to think about it. Your brain doesn't, your body doesn't send it up to the brain. It just bypasses it and makes a decision on its own. And that's what the interneuron is going to help do. It's going to help bypass the brain so that you have a much more quicker response to that particular stimulus. Okay. The terms irritability and conductivity deal with that response. Okay. The ability to respond to a stimulus and the ability to transmit an impulse. Okay. Both of these get worse as you get older, right? Your ability to respond to a stimulus and your ability to transmit those impulses slow down as you get older. And when you're not older, when you're young and vibrant and healthy, every individual is going to be different, right? That's why we have athletes, professional athletes, and that's why we have people that are not professional athletes, right? Some people's irritability and conductivity are much better than others naturally because of their genetics. Okay. The last thing we want to talk about is nerve impulses. And there are a couple of steps that are going to happen in order for a electrical impulse to go through a neuron. Okay. So we start with the resting neuron. Okay. The resting neuron is a neuron that is not reacting to a stimulus. Okay. And we're going to, this whole process deals with the movement of ions, which are electrically charged atoms, into and out of a neuron. Okay. We call that polarization, right? So if we have pluses and minuses, right? And on one side of the cell, there are pluses. On the other side of the cell, there are minuses. When it's at rest, there exists these poles, plus on one side, minus on the other. And we call that polarized, okay? If we disrupt that polarization, okay, we call that depolarization, okay? Which means that these charges are going to flip, and we call that depolarizing, okay? And that happens when a stimulus occurs, right? So when you're at rest, okay, when the neuron is resting, there is no stimulus. Your neurons are polarized, right? There are pluses on one side, there are minuses on the other. Once a stimulus occurs, that ball gets hit to you, your blood glucose is too high. Something happens, and what happens is depolarization occurs, where the charges on the outside and the inside of the cell switch places, and we call that depolarization. And where are these ions coming from? These ions are coming from sodium and potassium. Sodium is a plus, potassium is a negative. Okay? The exchange of these ions is going to cause what we call action potential, which is the movement of electricity down a neuron. Okay, so let me go to the next. So that was step 2. So step 1 is rest. Step 2 is when there's a stimulus, depolarization occurs. Okay, here is a neuron at rest. Okay, this one, first one up here, is a resting neuron. And we can see that our plus ions are on the outside, our negative ions are on the inside. That should be a negative, that should be a positive. Okay, our plus sodiums are on the outside, our negatives are on the inside. This is polarized. Okay, so this is a polarized neuron. Then something happens. A stimulus occurs. Whatever that stimulus is, a ball, a rise in a chemical in the body, someone yelling, it doesn't matter, a loud noise. Okay, what's going to happen is that the charges are going to start switching places. The pluses are going to move in, the minuses are going to move out. Okay, and that's called depolarization. And that's due to a stimulus occurring. Okay, so that was step 1 and 2. The next thing would be this action potential begins. Okay, and what action potential is the movement of these electrical impulses down the neuron. Okay, so let me take a look. I'll just show you this picture because it'll make more sense. Okay, so once you start to depolarize a neuron, it's going to continue down the entire neuron. Okay, so once you start flipping those charges, it's going to propagate. Propagate means it's going to flow. It's going to continue in a line, in a succession. So here, it started with 1, then it went to 2, and then down here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it's going to continue to do this. And this is the actual movement of electricity. That's how electricity is produced. It's the movement of electrons from one place to another. That's why you have a plus side of a battery and a minus side of a battery, right? Same thing. You put the pluses and the minuses in different directions so that the flow of electricity can flow through that electronic device. You're doing the same thing here, right? So we started off with a resting neuron. Charges are staying where they're supposed to be. And then a stimulus causes a depolarization, which ends up causing action potential, which is the propagation of this depolarization. That's all action potential is. It's the movement or the continuation of this depolarization from one side of a neuron to the next, right? And then once that action is resolved, once the stimulus is resolved, you catch the ball, you throw it to first base, or your body reacts to that rise in glucose. Your body then repolarizes and brings those electrons back to their original position, right? So that repolarization will occur where the pluses that moved onto the inside will move back to the outside. The minuses will move back to the inside. It will propagate along the entire neuron again and repolarize until you are back to a resting neuron. Okay. We call this the sodium-potassium pump. I mentioned it a little bit when we talked about muscles and how muscles work, especially with active and passive transport. Okay. But this is how it also works in the nervous system. So once again, resting nerve, pluses on the outside, minuses on the inside. a stimulus occurs, which causes depolarization, which is the movement or switching of these charges. This triggers an action potential, where the switch of the depolarization propagates along the neuron until that action is resolved, until that stimulus is resolved, and you repolarize and go back to your normal state. And that is going to do it for this particular lecture. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comment section below, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.